Usually, oil and gas are the first things that jump to one's mind when we discuss geopolitics or trade wars. But given the trend of increasing electrification, the power sector has become a growing feature of such conflicts. With me to discuss such recent developments and their ramifications on the electricity sector is Aldo Flores, the non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute. Hi, Aldo. Welcome to the show. A few recent developments in several regions around the world have caught your attention with regards to the power sector falling victim, if you will, of the geopolitical tug of war. Would you kindly highlight these cases for us and the viewers?
Yes, Nasser, absolutely a pleasure to be with you. We've been seeing in the last 4 months the rise of electricity conflict, electricity trade conflict in a way that we hadn't seen it before. And 4 examples that are pretty relevant here are first, the threat that the Canadian province of Ontario made to the U.S. in retaliation for President Trump's intended tariffs on Canada. And there was a threat to stop electricity trade, or to tax, rather, electricity trade from Ontario to Canada as a sanction, as punishment for this threat. We saw as well in the Middle East the ending of the waiver that the U.S. had given Iran and Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran. Iran has been under a sanctions regime and was not allowed to export, to benefit from energy exports elsewhere. But there was a waiver that allowed Iraq to purchase electricity from Iran, and that has been basically ended. Then we saw the type of potential development in Europe, in which Norway is considering not to export electricity to Europe because there's discomfort with European rules on electricity trade, but more fundamentally because of droughts that have reduced the availability of hydropower in Norway. These examples, among others, point to a new kind of challenge for energy security and energy trade. We used to think about this, as you mentioned, mainly in terms of oil and gas. But as countries are electrifying and as the push for greater electricity integration, the integration of grids is increasing, we're going to see more challenges in managing interdependence and energy trade between countries.
Well, Aldo, Europe today has the most extensive set of electricity interconnections, representing about 50% of the global cross-border transmission capacity. So Europe maybe is a prime example of, so far, successful power interconnections. But you think that Europe holds 2 contrasting views about electricity integration. How, if you may expand more on that idea?
You know, it used to be that integration was seen on energy as mainly a source of cooperation, as an avenue to increase the benefits for nations and to reduce the prospect for conflict. And so Europe made significant investments to integrate its energy sector with Russia. We can think of natural gas pipelines that supplied 40% of Europe's consumption of natural gas before the Russian invasion on Ukraine, and that provided about 50% or 20% rather of the support to electricity generation in Europe. That type of trade was based on a notion of trust, on the belief that Russia was a dependable and non-hostile partner. But obviously, events have upended that conclusion, and the idea that integration, regardless of the type of country you're integrating with, works better, is not so fashionable, not so strong. So Europe is therefore expanding its own internal integration of its grid, but decoupling from Russia. And this, by the way, we see it in a fourth case I forgot to mention in my first answer, with the Baltic states also disintegrating from the Russian, Belarusian grid. And this is again out of distrust. There is less enthusiasm for having energy trade with Russia. If energy can be weaponized, energy trade can be weaponized. And that is, again, the challenge that we're seeing with respect to electricity trade in more areas and with more frequency, at least over the last few months.
Mm-hmm. But Aldo, maybe this contrasting view, or the two contrasting views as well for Europe, holds internally as well between EU members with internal interconnections in power grids as well?
Well, yes, there are two factors here. One is that the grid integration makes energy systems, the power system more flexible, more, in principle, more resilient, and more able to serve consumers. But this integration has to be cost effective. And what the Norwegian case with Europe shows is that if integration means more costly management of your grid and your power system, then it may not be as a clear proposition as many expected. And we're seeing this type of discomfort even inside Europe. Integrating with a country that, like Germany, that has been pursuing the use of renewables in a much more intensive way than others. And that country has therefore higher costs of system management, and you have to absorb or participate in those higher costs, then it may not be such a good idea. So it's a combination of trust in the intentions of your partners, of trust in the regulatory regime, of trust in the investment regime. It's a multidimensional equation that governments have to be working with in order to manage this type of integration in a successful way.
So, Aldo, does greater cross-border grid integration enhance energy security and incentivizes further collaboration, or could it become vulnerable to politically motivated disruptions and the source of conflict between neighboring countries? What's the final judgment on this, in your opinion?
Well, in weighing the risks and the benefits of this integration, it's obviously very important to have an idea, an estimation of the reliability of your partner. If your partner is reliable, if it's an ally, then integration enhances your energy security. If you have doubts about your partner's or your potential partner's intentions, then it is not so clear. But we have, if I may add a couple of cases,
please.
Two couple of examples of what integration can mean for energy security. If you recall, in 2011, Japan faced a Fukushima nuclear accident. If Japan had followed a policy of no integration with the rest of the world, and that is relying on energy trade, and only sought to satisfy its own energy, power needs by relying on nuclear energy, this accident, which triggered a shutdown of many power plants, would have been quite catastrophic for the Japanese economy. Instead, Japan relied on its infrastructure and its network of suppliers to compensate for the loss of nuclear power and instead increase imports of liquefied natural gas and other fossil fuels. So integration, international energy trade, interdependence allowed Japan to come back from that accident. Compare this with the Texan experience 10 years later, that is in 2021, with the deep freeze that came with with Storm Uri. Texas has been following a power strategy, an electricity strategy, system strategy of full independence, of not being integrated with the rest of the grid, because in Texas they don't like very much regulation from the federal government. The result is that when system failure happened, when the deep freeze affected the availability of natural gas, which in turn affected power supply, which in turn affected the management of water pumps and systems, and the overall digital management of the grid, there was no way to come back with the support of external sources. So many Texans found themselves without power supply for a number of days. So you have here two contrasting cases in which international electricity trade and energy trade enhances your energy security as opposed to weakening it.
Aldo, let's go back to one of the previous examples you mentioned earlier, which is the threat by Ontario in Canada to levy tariffs on its electricity exports to the US. These threats were, of course, averted for now, but do you think these threats were really meaningful? How big of a threat was it really, specifically to the three states that receive most of that Ontario power?
Well, they certainly were meaningful as a symbol, as a measure of discomfort and disappointment on the Canadian side with respect to what the U.S. Tariff policy meant for the historic partnership between both countries. But in terms of what they meant for the American electricity supply, they were not that relevant. Power exports, electricity exports from Canada to the U.S. represent 0.3%, just about, of total electricity supply to the U.S. And for the affected states in the American Northeast, this was less than 3 or 1% of what New York and Michigan and Minnesota and the affected states are actually consuming of Canadian power. So it would not have been that big of a disruption, but it was very significant, in my view, that the mere consideration of using energy as a sanction, weaponizing energy as a tool for negotiation in non-energy related areas, in this case economic trade, is just very, very telling of the difficult times in which we are now living.
Aldo, you, of course, were the deputy to the Energy Secretary for Hydrocarbons in Mexico. So let's shift our focus to Mexico. Trump has threatened tariffs on energy imports from your country. This has been exempted for now, but we would like for you to explain to us the US-Mexico energy relationship, how such tariffs, if they are ever levied, would affect Mexico's energy exports and prices at home.
Sure. Well, the key thing to have in mind is that Mexico's oil and gas production has been declining for just about 20 years. So that has meant that Mexico has steadily been increasing its imports of fuels and mainly natural gas and liquid fuels from the U.S. and other regions throughout all of this time. So since about 10 years ago, Mexico is a net importer of natural gas and other fuels from the United States. And these imports of natural gas now represent 70% of Mexico's consumption. And of fuels, it's about 60%. So Mexico is very dependent on the supply of fuels from the United States. And doesn't have many options of diversifying this trade when it comes to natural gas. It can do so if it's about importing gasoline or petrol or diesel, because that's a very liquid global market, but not with natural gas. So what has been happening is that Mexico is beginning to redirect some of its crude exports, which are also liquid, to other parts of the world, but it is not so able to do so with respect to natural gas. And therein lies a key question about Mexico's energy security strategy. How much should Mexico depend on one very large supplier of natural gas, and how much should Mexico should be willing to pay the additional cost of diversifying its natural gas supplies? It's not an easy equation. It's not unlike the type of considerations that were being discussed in Europe about greater integration with Russia, because natural gas was cheap and because it led to cooperation. In the case of North America, natural gas is the cheapest of them all, so it's a very beneficial decision for Mexico to import natural gas. And the U.S. and Mexico are allies. Well, the jury's out about what this means in terms of economic exchanges and tariffs on energy trade.
Aldo, you've participated in the negotiations and actually in the final signing of the Declaration of Cooperation Agreement known as OPEC PLUS back in 2016. Mexico is still a signatory, but has since seems to have sat on the sidelines, if you may, of OPEC Plus. Why is that?
Well, the short reason is that, the short answer is that Mexico does not have the type of leeway other countries have in adjusting its production. And as I said, Mexico's production has been declining yearly for the last 20 years. Actually, Mexico is taking out from the global market about 100,000 barrels per day every year. So Mexico is by default contributing to the aim of not oversupplying the market, that aim that OPEC Plus has. And that was, by the way, one of the realities when Mexico joined OPEC Plus. It was evident that Mexico could only support the rationale of stabilizing the oil market, but that it had strong limitations with decreasing its production beyond the natural rate of decline that it was already experiencing. So that's why Mexico is a participant and to these meetings, but it cannot actually adjust its production further, and it is contributing by default with its own declining production to the aim, as I said, of not oversupplying the market. These won't change in the foreseeable future.
What potential does Mexican oil and gas production have, and how do you see that unfolding moving forward under the new presidency of Claudia Sheinbaum?
Mexico's potential is still very strong. We saw clear evidence of this when Mexico opened up to international investment, and companies from all over the world made commitments to participate in the Mexican oil industry. These commitments changed because the Mexican energy policy changed and the opening was reversed. Now the strategy is to rely again much more on Pemex to make the best of the potential resources that Mexico has. By all accounts, all experts say that while the era of easy oil is beyond, we are still in Mexico, in a country that has significant potential. Prospective reserves are considerable. And so a campaign to increase investment in the oil industry in Mexico can yield substantial results. Let me just add to this that, for example, the Eagle Ford formation in Texas, in the south of Texas, which is a very successful area for producing natural gas, extends into Mexico. And it's actually larger on the Mexican side. Should Mexico decide to pursue a strategy of using more hydraulic fracturing, the type of technique that made unconventional oil production so successful in the U.S., then the potential for producing much more natural gas and reduce the dependence on imports of natural gas is substantial. But there is also substantial potential in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And yes, it is the Gulf of Mexico, despite what has been...
what Trump wants to name it.
So there's still a lot of potential there. It's a matter of getting the rules right so that investors and Pemex itself are more enthusiastic about these projects.
Okay.
In the next few months, we expect to learn more about the new rules for partnerships between Pemex and private companies. And then we have a more clear idea of what the production prospects might be.
Finally, Aldo, the energy transition narrative has shifted in the last 2 years or so, where the more ambitious scenarios have been on the retreat and looking more and more unfeasible. Of course, emissions are still a problem that need to be addressed in our global fight against climate change, but setting aside the economic and technological aspects of it, what are the political challenges that face the transition in your mind?
Well, first, there's a component about the volatility of policies in countries. And by that, I mean that we have investment regimes that are not, and rules that are not so stable. Governments are giving mixed signals about their commitment to investment rules that have to last for a very long time, and I mean decades, for these investments to prosper. So unclear signals about investment that are a challenge, and politics has to do a lot with this lack of clarity. Then we have the reality that many communities have a hard time welcoming more energy investments. The land occupation of renewable energy projects is much larger, significantly much larger than that of fossil fuel projects. That means a lot of consultation and negotiation with stakeholders that are affected by these projects. It's a time-consuming process, a very intense process that is affected by this not in my backyard mentality. And that slows down the pace of investments. Then, in principle, if you want an energy transition that works, you need to make fossil fuels relatively more costly than they are today with respect to renewable energies. And by that, I mean that you have to take into consideration the cost over the environment. So there's this emission taxes that have been discussed for so long on emissions trading that would add a price or a percentage of the price of fuels to the normal market price. Well, it turns out that people don't like high fuel prices, and whenever such increases happen, we have seen when countries have attempted to do away with this type of subsidies, we see a lot of street protests, a lot of backlash, and a reversal. So there we have yet another challenge for the transition. So the economic costs, which translate into political behavior are affecting the pace of the transition.
Yes.
You can add to that the technological challenges, and this makes the transition much more difficult than it has been envisioned at the outset.
Aldo, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for taking the time. Aldo Flores, the non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute. Welcome.